Okay, good morning. It looks like the number of participants joining has slowly ground to a halt. Maybe a few people are still slowly connecting, but I think we've got enough participants to kick off the session. So just a quick hello from Maastricht University in the Netherlands. So I'm Donna and I work for EDLAB, and EDLAB is the Maastricht University's Institute for Innovation in Education. And here I'm responsible for our continuing professional development activities. So I'm really excited today to be joined by my colleague, Aincre Evans, who is a teaching fellow at University College Maastricht, which is part of Maastricht University. Can you just say a quick hello, Aincre, so that people can see you on screen?
Hi, everybody. Nice.
Thank you. So Aincre will be kicking off our continuing professional development activities for this academic year with today's webinar, which is also part of the UFA D&I lecture series. So we're really excited to be able to offer this to you today. Also joining me today is Ophelie, and Ophelie is a junior policy advisor at Maastricht University's Diversity and Inclusivity Office. Ophelie, can you say a quick hello so that people can see you?
Hello, hello.
Thank you. So the way that a Zoom webinar works is quite a few of you have probably noticed you can't see yourself on screen and you don't have access to the mic. So you can only see today's speaker, who's Aincre, and Ophelie, who's helping me to moderate today's session. If you do have questions, we advise you to pose any questions throughout the session using the Q&A rather than the chat function, and Ophelie and I will be moderating the Q&A as we go ahead. The webinar is going to start with a presentation by Aincre. So she'll start by giving a bit of background and introduction of herself, and then give a presentation. We'll keep an eye on the questions that come in through the presentation, but instead of disturbing the presentation, we'll start referring to those at the end, and we'll pose your questions on your behalf to Aincre at the end of the formal part of the presentation. I should also mention that today's session is also being recorded for those who couldn't make it, or for those of you who want to rewatch sections of this webinar, and I'll send an email around as soon as that goes live later this week or the beginning of next week. Guys, am I forgetting anything before we start the formal program?
I will just say, if anybody is wanting to write anything in the chat towards either the panelists, also the three of us, or all attendants, just check who you're sending the messages to, because I see a lot of people are sending messages that I think only Aincre, Donna and I can see. So if you want to talk to everybody else, just make sure you're talking to everybody else.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So if you go into the chat function, there's a little drop-down list and you can change who you're sending your messages to. Some people are asking how many are we today. We are currently with 163 participants. So welcome everybody. We're really excited to be able to offer this session for you today. And with that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Aincre Evans.
Nice. Okay, so I'm going to share screen, everybody. I hope everybody can see this. Great. Okay, so then we can start. So hello and welcome to this lecture on Decolonizing the Curriculum, given by EDLAB at Maastricht University. My name is Aincre Evans. I'm Ghanaian and I work as a teaching fellow in Maastricht University here in the Netherlands. My work predominantly focuses on African studies, Southern feminisms, and also the intersection between gender and development. So today's lecture is really going to be introductory in nature. So an introduction into the subject of decolonizing the curriculum, as well as an overview of some of the decolonizing strategies that one can begin to then implement and put into good practice on a course and also a classroom level. So throughout our conversations, you might come to reflect on either the courses you're creating or the classes that you're giving on a deeper level, and want to take a bit of a dive into your respective disciplines. I do want to reiterate that I'm still very much in the process of learning and unlearning myself. And so I want to reiterate that I'm not a voice piece on decolonization, but I'm just somebody who, given the current state of affairs, also wants to share my learning process with you and probe you to start your own. Okay, so that being said, I'm sure, as you guys have seen beforehand in the advertised description of the lecture, the overarching aim of this conversation is not to provide you only with concrete strategies, but also perhaps to, or more importantly, to familiarize you with the rhetoric that grounds these key takeaways. So the presentation is really going to try and ask the question of how do we understand and see the call for decolonization, particularly in the context of the university, and how do we respond to it? How, from this understanding, do we generate or conceptualize a broader approach within decolonization, and then start to implement this more concretely in the classroom before then concluding. So then the key learning objectives, because this is it's a very big conversation, obviously, and it's a broad subject, and we only have a short period of time. So the key learning objectives for this presentation is really to understand what the call for decolonization is and what it targets, and to start to be a little more familiar with concepts such as reconstruction and deconstruction and the idea of connected sociologies, as well as then to assist you in developing some practical tools or practical concepts as well that help in the integration of decolonizing strategies. So first, we have the call for decolonization and understanding the call for decolonization, right? What is it? It has been sounded from different parts of the world and different corners of the globe. And in the past few years, mainly thanks to the presence of social media and also thanks to the presence of other channels such as the news, these calls are no longer quietened but have been amplified, right? So we have movements such as the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, the My Curriculum is White campaign, and the Decolonize the Curriculum campaign. And these movements all have paid critical attention to not only the content of university curriculum, but the barriers that prevent BIPOC students from engaging with their education, from South Africa to Ghana to Germany, also to the Netherlands and the UK. But what exactly does this entail and where does it come from? So what I want to start by doing is introducing you guys to a clip or an example of how this has been verbalized by students in the London School of Economics. Please bear with me in terms of technology. I really hope this works and that you can all hear this. But what I want to introduce you guys to is, like I said, really how this call has been verbalized and framed by students themselves. And I think it's important to recognize that beyond this lecture, these discussions are also still ongoing and are targeted in different ways. So let's take a little look.
I definitely think that we do have a white curriculum, and I think when we discuss whether or not our curriculum is white, we also definitely are talking about a wider conversation on colonialism, post-imperialism, that kind of thing. And so not only is our curriculum white, but it's white from an imperialist time, white from a time when we didn't even have the most basic understanding of racial issues or post-colonial issues or anything like that. So I think these two things actually really go together.
I think we definitely do. I think you see this in every single department. I've been at LSE for a year and a half, and I've taken courses in 3 departments. And I think in every single department, they overwhelmingly have a white curriculum. And that's funny, it's not just a British curriculum or an American curriculum, it's a white, very, very clearly white. You know, you have diversity in terms of where people are from. You have diversity if they're from America or they're from Holland, but it tends to be white, which I think in itself is limiting. A lot of perspectives do take on perhaps the British or the Eurocentric perspective, which I think also contributes to the idea of a white curriculum. Yeah, a lot of perspectives are missed out. And the Western perspective, the best part is it isn't shown as a perspective, it's just shown as what is the truth. And that's the problem with the white curriculum, is showing something as the truth as opposed to a perspective. And that's definitely what.
Yeah. So that was just a short introduction. And as you can see from this video, the call for decolonization specifically is centered on the university itself when talking about the curriculum, right? And this is a key focal point as the way we approach and view and acknowledge the history of the university as a legitimate body of the colonial is integral to how we then respond and participate in this conversation. So for the calls for and around decolonizing the curriculum really target the fact that the university and its curriculum are predominantly governed for the West and by the West. So universities have played a role as infrastructure of empire, and shying away from this history deters and prevents us from having important conversations about the implications of such a role on knowledge production that is inseparable from power relations. So consequently, the call for decolonization in the context of curriculum really discusses legacy and perpetuation of that history in today's higher education institutions. So this is why a lot of the conversations and activity targeted at decolonizing the university and decolonizing curriculum are really kind of led by individuals and groups that have had direct exposure to these institutions and its legacy. Here we have an example of British Caribbean activist Akala, who has given lectures at Oxford and Cambridge and as advertised on the screen, here at Leicester University. Also Amsterdam University, Decolonizing the Curriculum, Practical Approaches of Decolonial Theories, that was given in the summer. And also from people like Mels Owusu, who is a Ghanaian British activist. They gave a TED talk on decolonizing the curriculum and have recently been in the news for launching the first free Black university in the UK, which will exist as a decolonized institution. I think currently they're up to over £300,000 in crowdfunding to even lectures like this one. So the key understanding and takeaway here is that it was universities that really supported and propelled colonial intellectuals in their theories of racial taxonomy and also on Western superiority, and really contributed to paving the moral and then ethical ground for epistemic violence and the maltreatment of subjects in overseas territories, as well as internally within Europe towards migrants and minorities. The European rationale and Western knowledge was not only created and disseminated through the university, but the notion of the university that we still have today still largely draws from a Western project of civilization. And interrogating then and disrupting this is key to the call for decolonization. So at their core, these different movements are really trying to combat the continuation of a largely Eurocentric canon that is continuously, and whether that be implicitly or explicitly, presented as universal, and the effects of this historically and then today. So to begin with, particularly concerning the fact that a lot of you are education practitioners, we sometimes instinctively want to clarify. We want to define, gain a solid basis for what exactly it is that we're talking about here, right? What do we mean by decolonization? Can you be specific when you talk about Eurocentrism, colonial legacy? Which colonial legacy? What exactly do these terms mean? And how can we then begin to approach decolonization as a tangible destination, if anything? So this brings us to the second section of this presentation, which is really understanding decolonization. But before we talk of defining, I think it's important to be just very honest with you all about the fact that decolonizing and decolonization just involves a multitude of different definitions, interpretations, aims, and strategies that are all based on particular contexts. So there's a quote that I want to show you from Gominda Bambara, who we're going to talk about a little more later. But I think that this quote aptly explains the fact that there is a multiplicity of perspectives within decolonization. And this shouldn't be surprising given the various historical and political sites of decolonization that span the globe and 500 years of history. Alongside this, we also cannot undermine the fact that there are important methodological and epistemological reasons to emphasize the contestation for definitions of decolonization, or even wanting to define in the first place, which current debates also happening across the decolonization movement and within decoloniality specifically. So I am not going to attempt in this short time to try and define what exactly decolonization is, therefore, but what we can do is then try and trace the common underpinnings that typically comprises the decolonization movement. So there are widely agreed upon tenets of decolonization, and where I can say that decolonization is a process rather than a destination that not only aims to target and undo the violence of a Eurocentric canon, but then also simultaneously situate the intentionality that exists behind the colonial project, because the way we approach colonialism, empire, and racism historically often tries to place these processes as historical accident, or often also heavy mistakes of history. But within decolonization, it's important to also unveil and acknowledge the intentionality, the mass wealth, and the labor that was invested, as well as the academic rigor. that was invested into the processes of colonization, also as an investment that had huge direct returns to the West. So to underplay the agency and the intention of the Western world in these processes, and the knowledge production of racism, is also to underplay the violence with which it operated in. So people often cite the term decolonization as inherently aggressive. They say, you know, when talking about an academic institution here, we're talking about curriculum and students. Why do you have to use the word decolonize? You know, that has such an aggressive connotation to it. And I think it's kind of ironic because people then situate the undoing or the detangling process as aggressive rather than the actual colonization of that knowledge. So this is also something to keep in mind moving forward. Now, another key machinery of the decolonization movement, for me, it's really its commitment to the push forward or moving forward. So the point is not only then to deconstruct the knowledge and production mechanisms that are rooted in the universalization of Europe, but also to transform them, right? So, and this transformation is in no way blanketly applicable, but must be located in both the acknowledgement of this history we just discussed and then committed to the construction of new mechanisms of knowledge production that are more geopolitically inclusive and that also decenter Europe. So this is a big and multifaceted agenda that we're discussing here. So what are then some of the approaches or the broader approaches that we can start to take within this, given the fact that it is so multifaceted and it is so complicated? What are some of the key steps we can take to navigate this process? So of course, I can't dive into their work in such depth, but I would like to briefly introduce Achille Mbembe, who is a prominent Cameroonian philosopher and author, and also, as I mentioned beforehand, Gaminda Bambara, who like I said, I briefly introduced. Bambara is a professor of post-colonial and decolonial studies at Sussex University, and both Mbembe and Bambara have dedicated a large part of their work to the question of decolonization and the theorization of the decolonial, as well as towards the broader than approaches that decolonial strategies could adopt or even uphold. So according to Mbembe, decolonization, amongst many things, concerns really targeting the Eurocentric canon. For Mbembe, a Eurocentric canon is one that attributes not only truth to the Western way of knowledge production. It's a canon that disregards other epistemic traditions at its core and tries to portray colonialism as somewhat of a normal form of social relations between human beings rather than a system of exploitation and oppression. He says also furthermore that Western epistemic traditions are traditions that claim detachment of the known from the knower, which is interesting because he says they rest on a division between mind and world or between reason and nature as an ontological a priori. They are traditions in which the knowing subject is enclosed in itself and peeks out of a world of objects and produces supposedly objective knowledge of those objects. So then the knowing subject is thus able, we are told, to know the world without being a part of that world, and he or she is by all accounts able to produce knowledge that is supposed to be universal and then independent of context. The problem for him comes then is the fact it comes when this tradition is taken as hegemonic or becomes hegemonic, right? So this hegemonic notion of knowledge production has generated a discursive scientific practices and interpretive frames that really make it difficult to think outside of these frames. And this isn't all, but the tradition has also repressed anything that also tries to criticize it. And this becomes difficult. So for these reasons, for Mbembe, decolonizing also encompasses both the institution, so the university, and the decolonization of knowledge itself. So the following quote taken by Mbembe really just features him explaining the essence of decolonization, which he says the first part is a critique of the dominant Eurocentric academic model, which we discussed briefly. The fight against what Latin American scholars in particular call epistemic coloniality, and then which is the endless production of theories based on European traditions and produced nearly always by Europeans or European American men, who are then the only ones accepted as capable of reaching this idea of universality or truth. and which is a particular anthropological knowledge and process of knowing about others, but a process that at the same time never fully acknowledges these others as thinking and knowledge producing subjects in themselves. So Gominda Bambara then, I don't want to say she frames this further because they're not necessarily in direct conversation, but for me personally, she then takes this further and claims that that within a decolonizing process, there needs to be both a deconstruction and a reconstruction that accompanies this process. So reconstruction then is a shift from a focus on comparative sociologies to connected sociologies, which we're going to try and get into a little bit. So what Bambara says is, while knowledge can never be total, the selections we make have consequences for its ordering. If we can try to understand deconstruction to be the process of unpacking, right, deconstructing the European canon, Bambara then argues that after deconstruction, there is the necessity of a decolonial reconstruction, which would involve a shift methodologically from a focus on comparative history, like I said, to a history and a sociology that focuses on connections. So reconstruction then goes beyond the unpacking of the canon and places its efforts really in the transformation of knowledge based on the acknowledgement that there are central narratives that may, when uncovered, shift our understanding. And here we come to more specifically the concept of connected sociologies, which in essence, Bambara says, there is no connection where there is no reconstruction, and no understanding remains unchanged by connection. And this may seem a little difficult to gauge at first, or a little difficult to kind of fully understand, but we're going to try and go through it a little bit. So the push to reconstruction is quite central to Bambara's meaning of connected sociologies, where she says to understand socio-historical events through their connections is really to acknowledge then from the beginning that addressing particular sets of connections undeniably leads to certain forms of understanding, which can be put in question through new sets of understanding and new sets of connections, right? And what is really valuable for me about this is that Bambara explicitly states this is not a choice guided by whims. So you don't select these new connections just based on what you want to visibly see as present, but through a well-considered argument for why certain connections were initially chosen and why choosing others could then lead to more adequate and honest explanations. So the point is not simply that there are a series of alternative histories that need to be acknowledged, but that in doing so, what is involved is a reformed understanding of the processes represented within dominant histories. So it's not simply that different people have different perspectives, but that these different perspectives also provide a basis for the systematic reconsideration of European and Eurocentric grand narratives. So connected sociologies, Bambara suggests, are articulations of different narratives and are the means for understanding sociology and its tasks differently, which, given the current political state of affairs globally, is not a light issue we should take lightly. It is to recognize the politics and intellectual engagement will always take place at a specific time in specific moments, and these moments are open to systematic and rigorous reflection in terms of the connections that they reveal. So Bambara's connected sociologies, beyond just being important as a broader approach, is also significant for me in another way. When we evoke the idea of greater representation of BIPOC narratives, history, scholarship, and contributions within curriculum and within institutions, people kind of jump to the notion of, well, you know, we can't simply just erase or replace curriculum. You can't emotionally decide based just on your lived realities, which subjects you want to kind of take over and replace, and which stories you want to rewrite into the curriculum. And what the idea of connected sociologies then really does is it acknowledges, it counters tokenistic representation for me, because it really centers these contributions on the acknowledgement that, okay, we have a history that's intersecting and we have a history that is connected, and these narratives are important for this fuller understanding and appreciating this concept that we are trying to understand in its context itself. So as an example, which I'm going to try and go over. Barbara really focuses on the concept of modernity in her work. This is something that she really centers on. So when we look at the idea of modernity and the concept of the modern world, we often think of the democratic revolutions that promoted this concept or ushered us into the modern, as well as then the Industrial Revolution. And what Gaminda suggests is that if you have your two exemplars of societies that kind of ushered us into this modern, which are also engaged and shaped by the processes of colonization and slavery they're still engaged in, these aren't great examples. Why not then consider the role of the Haitian Revolution? And why do we not then insert this into the conversation and also allow this to develop our understanding of the modern world? And such an insertion and such a consideration might then help us to deconstruct this idea of the modern being associated to the Western, right? So why do we develop our understanding of democracy and the histories of the US and France, not taking into account their segregationist and colonial practices, but we allied Haiti from that same understanding? So this is an example that she gives. Okay, so at this point, I would like to also introduce storytelling as a possible decolonial strategy or an approach. We've covered where the contemporary call for decolonization comes from, a little bit about what it entails, and we've had a brief introduction to some of the broader approaches to decolonization and what that could entail in terms of deconstruction, reconstruction, and connected sociologies. But I think it's also important to talk about methodology. A large part of decolonization also has to do with unpacking the methodology that we use to teach and also research. Methodologies which we see as credible, as well as the sources that we draw from. So introducing storytelling as a decolonial strategy is often met with a lot of reserve, as it's seen as kind of going against this grain of objectivity and concrete learning, right? So unpacking the methodology we use to teach has also a lot to do with, on an individual level, what we kind of extend the hand of credibility to. Within higher education, we really center on peer-reviewed journals, articles, concrete textbooks as key sources of knowledge. But as educational practitioners, there are also a wide variety of work outside of this that can contribute to and add value to subjects and discourse that you present within your course or your class or even in your research. So building narratives and placing narratives and stories in conversation can create a depth to a subject that many students and also researchers and staff are sometimes missing in their experience of higher education. And by storytelling, I really mean drawing specifically from people's lived realities and even sometimes works of fiction that can then be used to challenge and provoke a different strain of thought within a broader subject and discourse. So contextually coming from Ghana, I also draw my storytelling practice from a different place than someone would, for example, in the Americas. And what a storytelling approach does, as we're going to see in a little bit, it allows for more of a reflexive and relatable approach to teaching, where you kind of visibly see people's lived experiences and then add this to the conversation in the classroom, rather than simply creating a distance between objective truth and also people's subjective realities, right? And this adds to then the building of a more complete conversation. So as I guess a concrete example, I recently gave a workshop in Berlin, literally like a week and a half ago, around African feminisms. And to provoke this conversation, I printed out an excerpt from a chapter of Ama Ataidu's novel Changes. I don't know if any of you have heard of this or read it. And basically the specific excerpt that I showed presented this intergenerational conversation around marriage, women's expectations, and kind of the sacrifice women make or have to make or expected to make in Ghanaian society at the time. So it's a conversation between a grandmother and her granddaughter who is recently divorced, and kind of the consequences of her recent actions around how she is going to be consequently viewed as a woman in a newly independent Ghana. So what I did was I asked each participant to highlight the elements of the text that specifically spoke to their feminism or stood out to them. And then I used this as a springboard into a more critical conversation where I made a dialectic connection between the novel and post-colonial feminist theory that was probed by this specific element of storytelling. And what this does is it makes more intersectional and complete conversations. People related to it in entirely different ways. And all of these narratives then helped us critically reflect on the broader theoretical framework which we were trying to navigate. And this is also something then I'm experimenting or considering experimenting with in Maastricht University, also around the Idea of Africa course that I teach. Right. So I also wanted to show a quote by Shawnee Pete, who's a professor at Regina University. And they explained that they position storytelling in the realm of qualitative research alongside narrative inquiry and self-study research traditions, where both of these traditions, they say, turn the research gaze inward, like I was saying, a reflexive practice of storytelling, of telling the story and then engaging in a critical examination of, okay, how have you come to know what you know? So this for me is then where true decolonization happens. It's not simply replacing indigenous or previously colonized peoples into the same positions held by people who were previously colonizers. Decolonization really includes the visibility of different methodologies that might be outside and might lie well outside Western epistemological traditions of teaching, right? At this point, I also wanted to just provoke a reflection on the kind of narrative you're creating individually within your own respective courses and classes. You know, who do you involve in the conversation? Who do you place in conversation with each other? And if you, of course, you're never going to be able to teach a complete story, right? But if you aren't and you acknowledge that, are you at least honest about it? So this is also something to then reflect on. Okay. So this is the last, I guess, concrete section of this presentation, which focuses and centers more on our interactions in the classroom. So we've moved from broader approaches, and what I'm going to talk about more specifically is positionality and then reflexivity or responsiveness and inflection. And these are practices that I've specifically tried to implement in my teaching inside and outside of the classroom and the university as well. And there are also practices and concepts for those of you who've already signed up for the workshop next Wednesday in Maastricht University. We might get the chance to dive into a little more deeply in relation to problem-based learning specifically next Wednesday. Okay, so positionality. By positionality, I really mean to encourage you to critically situate your knowledge and to locate the geopolitical context of who you're teaching about. Positionality is often hallmarked as an essential tool to overcome the monocultural approach to knowledge that many universities still take, and Eurocentrism in general. So when we look at Eurocentric teaching practices or approaches to knowledge, they kind of, like we have said recurringly, assume this universal validity and reproduce an abstract, almost vantage point of the knowing subject, right? And in doing so, they disregard or negate the location of all knowledges, and in particular, they remove the location of the dominant position of knowledge, and they seal it under this veil of universality, which is what Mbembe was addressing. So practices of positionality are really those practices that allow us to, even while teaching the canon, to still reveal the geopolitical location of the knowledge we're giving, and that is, knowledge is always taught in the situated manner. Right? So as I said, be open about the incomplete narratives, particularly also in your course titles and content. If you are teaching a course on contemporary world history and it's actually European history, be honest about locating this, right? So don't deceive the students that are going to sign up, because we're all attracted to more diverse and I guess broad courses, but in actuality, what are you teaching and how are you situating that knowledge that you teach, and how are you framing it if you are framing it as universal? A quote here is by Amsterdam University that did a study into diversity. This is from the Diversity Commission, and it says that a university that engages in positioning its own knowledge practices is a university that reveals the intersection conditions of knowledge production, and that unequivocally how the axes of differentiation alongside class and gender and race have been essential for establishing the canon, and also then how these same practices have been essential in reproducing these very same axes of discrimination, which I think is a very apt quote. You can also refer to the study by Amsterdam University. It's very interesting. The second point is reflexivity. By responsiveness and reflexivity, I really mean to say a relational approach to teaching. And this comes from the acknowledgement that the makeup of your classroom really does interact with the knowledge that you're teaching in that classroom. And for me, this really comes down to the recognition that teaching is also meaning making. And the content of the canon will undeniably have different meaning for different people, from the different students in your room, but also for you, right? And that's something to acknowledge, that you're also a person in your own classroom. So a relational approach is not simply just participatory. It's one in which the diverse backgrounds and lived experiences of the different participants in your classroom are actually rendered as valuable in the learning processes. So practices of teaching and learning that are really grounded in relational approaches or more democratic forms of teaching can really assist us in the contribution to decolonized forms of learning. Because through relational approaches, the positionality of the students isn't repressed, but actually becomes a tool for enriching and adding value to a classroom setting, and helps make your classroom just more inclusive. Right, so as a teacher or a lecturer, some of the things that I can then start to summarize to advise you is to be open to learn in your teaching spaces. When I teach my classes, even though I'm quite centered in African studies, there are elements of my own discipline that other students may have a niche in. For example, I had a student from Brazil who happened to know specific histories that I didn't. And I was very open to the fact that I would love them to suggest a reader if they had time for it, or I would be very open to just sitting down and chatting with them about how they thought this history could fit into this course. And this is being very open to you also as a learner in your own learning spaces, which I think is very important. Right, so encourage difficult conversations. When I say, okay, the lived experiences of your students will engage the material you teach differently, a lot of teachers and a lot of individuals kind of shy away from this and go, right, well, I don't want to have a situation where you have an activist in class acting up and then it becomes a really difficult and heated conversation. But actually, difficult conversations are fantastic. That's where a lot of the learning happens. But what is then necessary is facilitating and making time to talk about the communication tools necessary to conduct these conversations. So if you're going to have conversations that are difficult, you can immediately say, look, these are words I don't want to say or don't want said in my classroom, or these are phrases that let's avoid. But then give them also new words that they can use to communicate with each other. So don't just make rules of do not, but then also provide people at the same time with different pathways to navigate these difficult conversations. Something I always do is I ask my students, okay, hands up who's passionate about this and who's probably going to pursue a career that targets this subject in the future. And you'll see loads of hands flying up. And then from that, you go, right, so this classroom is a great opportunity for you guys to navigate the conversations you're undeniably going to have. And let's see if we can do that in a respectful way, right? And so encouraging difficult conversations is very much a good thing to do. Yes, so don't represent your knowledge in your course through tokenistic representation. Like I said, through the connected sociologies approach, for example, meaningfully construct your narratives. Don't just insert readers because you think it's nice to just have token diversity on your reading list, but spend your time and actually see how these narratives disrupt the greater narrative you're presenting in your course and how you can critically create a conversation between them. So this is also something I would advise, and be honest again about what you're teaching, what you're not, and frame it also as a choice. So you can say, right, well, I have to cover A, B, and C, but at the end of the day, it is a choice on who you decide to cover if you're in control of that on a course level. And in a class level, you can always talk to your coordinator and at least try and have an open conversation with them about the benefits of how this would at least contribute to a more multifaceted and complicated conversation, which is always interesting, right? And lastly, be kind to yourselves. Unlearning is a difficult process and it takes time. And like I said from the beginning, I'm still in my unlearning process. So this isn't going to be a day-to-day, month-to-month kind of thing. And it doesn't have a tangible destination, but it's just a continued process where you are constantly learning new things and unlearning things that you now see as problematic. So be kind to yourself in that process and recognize it takes time. Right, so conclusion. I hope that today, in this short time period, I've at least sparked your interest in decolonial theory, in the call for decolonization, and also hopefully complicated it a little bit for you. I know a lot of people see the call for decolonization as something which is really just about diversity, or in essence, replacement and forceful insertion. And I hope that this short presentation has allowed you to understand some of the different perspectives and broader approaches that uncover the nuance that exists within this topic. And I also hope that, reiterating the learning goals, you've gained somewhat of an understanding for what it is, and you're a little more familiar with the concepts of reconstruction and deconstruction and the notion of connected sociologies to dive into it deeper, and then also have a better idea of how this applies to practical teaching strategies in the classroom setting. Yeah, so I wanted to say a big thank you also at this point to Maastricht University for allowing me to give this short presentation. It's been very fun also to create it, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. And on that note, I just wanted to leave you with a very nice quote where I was recently in an online seminar with Bambara actually, and she said this sentence, and I had to write it down because it was so great. And she said, "Our world is not the modern world, it is the colonial world because we have not yet reconfigured this." And I think that's exactly the note that I wanted to end this presentation on. So thank you.
Fantastic, and thank you very much for your presentation this morning. I've got to admit, this was a completely new topic for me. My background is actually teaching in physics education. And yeah, so it was all completely new to me. And there were a few key points that came to mind as you were going through. So you mentioned a lot of things like it will take time, you need to be open to learn. And you said decolonization is a process. And this actually, it ties in, one of my questions personally was also similar to the question that we received from Eleanor, who was sent a question on the Q&A. And, you know, we've been educated ourselves from a Western standpoint. So in order to make progress, we have to re-educate ourselves. And you already said that takes time, but it got me thinking, we're a PBL institution here at Maastricht University, and actually using our students as resources and getting the students to actually contribute to content would be an ideal way of starting in that process, like you already said. But one of the questions that I have is, if you then want to assess the material, how can you do that if you're not an expert yourself and students are bringing in? How can you assess the quality of the resources or the stories that they're bringing in?
Well, you know, I think we have to be very careful what we mean by quality. For me, it really has to do with the fact that you don't have to necessarily, if you have an essay, for example, on critical race theory, and you feel distant from that topic yourself, you can focus on one, learning about it. So going out of your way to actually get a concrete understanding of this. You can do this beforehand with having students suggest topics to you and having an honest conversation about it. But then also really focusing on the way they present their arguments and also the way that they deliver it, because it's not necessarily that you have to assess the quality of their experiences, but then the way that they tie this into broader concepts and the way they relate this. And that is something I think people, regardless, can actually concretely approach.
Yeah, and that's really exciting to bring in these different viewpoints, especially at such an international university. But how do we prevent from, then this is a question from the Q&A, how do we prevent from getting this we and them and us and them? Like if you know, then your white students go, well, we can't bring in examples because those were the examples that we were already using. And so how do you get that mix? You know?
Yeah, I think actually it's not so much about kind of not, I want to say hiding, but blanketing people's positions, because you can say, right, I'm white, I grew up in Groningen my whole life in this in a town, and I'm coming here. That doesn't mean you don't have anything to contribute. Your contribution is still valid, but then it's nice to juxtapose that, right? And see, right, even though we're coming from very different backgrounds on this particular subject, how does our distance from each other affect how we can communally learn from this? And you're actually bringing in narratives that exist also in the outside world and recreating that kind of diversity then in your classroom setting. So I think that there's nothing wrong with unveiling people's positionality. And you don't even have to frame it within the us, them, and othering kind of mechanisms. You can really say, this is why I'm coming from in this, and it's interesting you're approaching it from this, because my lived realities give me this one perspective and you've just broadened that. And I don't think that, and I think through, again, communication tools and how you relate to one another and teaching your students how to do that in a classroom setting, you can kind of escape those pitfalls.
I think that ties in really nicely with our educational philosophy of collaborative and constructive learning that we have here. Yeah, Ophelie, did you have some questions that you wanted to pose from out of the chat as well?
Yeah, I've picked up one here that asks, I think it will tie nicely to the storytelling aspect that you brought up, but any advice on how to find more diverse narratives to weave into classes when all the standard textbooks are indeed strongly Eurocentric or Western?
Yes, definitely. One thing I wanted to add to the presentation, which I didn't for time's sake, it's a bit of a tangent, but co-creation is fantastic. So I'm sure as universities, like for example, on the UFI right now, you all have partner universities and collaborations. There's a whole network of institutions with researchers that I'm sure are more than happy to suggest one of their books, or also books that they've helped in teaching. So if you don't have access to that and you think, oh my gosh, this is such an insurmountable task that I have ahead of me, use your institutional connections to co-create something that you then feel more comfortable teaching in partnership, or then at least are more informed about through other researchers and other teachers that you can talk to. I definitely advise that. That's exactly what I did. For different subjects, and it worked perfectly well. Yeah,
I think that also ties into a similar question about specifically for the UFA universities and taking account different historical experiences of Central and Eastern Europe. I think, yeah, I would say similar. Your answer applies to this question as well. Of make use of your connections and the different people within your institutions and the institutions you have connections with. I would say that's one of the big benefits of the UFA Alliance, and the fact that we do have this access to so many other universities and their knowledge as well. Donna, do you have any other questions you've picked up on?
Yeah, well, talking about sharing knowledge, a couple of questions came in from different people about is it going to be more difficult to transform, or is it necessary even to transform other subject areas? So I know we've got a huge number of participants today from a variety of different fields, but somebody's mentioned law specifically, and somebody's also mentioned natural sciences, for example, that the quote was, a molecule is a molecule no matter whose perspective you look at it from. So yeah, I wondered what your take was on other subjects outside of your own.
Yeah, definitely. I do have good key examples with that. I think, for example, when you take medicine, and biology specifically in relation to the human body, what are you taking as normal? So whose body are you representing as normal, and whose examples are you then giving to people? I did focus group discussions in the university around racism, and one of the key experiences that kept coming back from medical students was the fact that they didn't know how to see symptoms based on different skin colors. And them going back to their home contexts, this is problematic for them, because actually this is what they need to work with. So being able to diversify also what you, like I said, what you represent as normal in the medical field, for example. And when it comes to subjects like law, engineering, that may seem a little more technical and specific, I did when I did I did research in Jamestown, Accra, and Ghana, and I was doing this on fish smoking technology, which is quite specific, but I was doing this on fish smoking technology and how they had designed ovens that don't produce a lot of smoke so that the women who smoke fish don't have to inhale this, you know, all very technical stuff. And they had designed the oven perfectly well. It didn't produce any smoke, and that the woman could inhale, and it seemed like a great solution. But in the process of that, they had also not realized that these women have been smoking fish for centuries, and actually they know their market more than anybody. So even though you're designing an oven that doesn't smoke fish, or doesn't, provoke health-related consequences to these women, you're still making them use a product that has a negative impact on their business, and they just won't use it. So even in the technical, there are narratives that you can expose your students to at these different intersections, which still recognize different types of diversity and different types of inclusion, alongside just what may seem like a technical strain of thought that can't be diversified, because science is science. But what kind of epistemological tradition are you then only drawing for, and what kind of context are you trying to apply this to?
Really nice. Just a lovely comment that I think we should pass on to you is someone saying this was explained in a way that they could access, and thank you very much for that. And I think that's probably accurate for a lot of people.
Nice, I'm happy to hear that. Thank you.
I also had some questions about people who they were saying, well, you know, our curriculum and our courses, you know, we're so task-centered, there's so much content to get through, we don't necessarily have time to include storytelling and a narrative and to draw on the experiences of our students. And I think that's a broader overarching question, and I think it's something that we really have to go back. It's these kind of events that are designed to raise awareness of how important this topic is, and to get people to rethink their curriculum and to rethink how we go around arranging what we want to do in the classroom.
Right. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I always say to people, I can kind of introduce you to the subject and you take from that what you want. But if you really feel like you don't have space, at the end of the day, I still think that then you have to sit in the intention of that choice. So if you choose, you can still teach something, but then try to reframe it in a different way, or put it in conversation in another way. And I think it doesn't necessarily have to start with these grand, challenging narratives that change your whole course up, but you can experiment in different ways with one particular task and how you choose to go about it, and get feedback from your students. And if they are actually then drawing more from that than your original mode of teaching or your original text that you're using, I think it's worthwhile considering more tasks within that course, and then taking it in a step-by-step approach. So it doesn't have to be everything all at once at the same time, but if you're finding it difficult to actually introduce this in a concrete way without being overwhelmed, start small and then build up and learn from it in that way.
I also have another, it's quite a general question, but this is obviously being offered as part of the Youth for D&I lecture series, and Ophelie works in diversity and inclusivity. So my question would be, actually, what's the difference between diversity and decolonization? And one of the questions that we also had coming in was, how does decolonization and the process, how can you draw parallels with that and with what's going on with other underrepresented groups like women and like there's also a movement to include more diversity in our teaching in general.
Yes, for sure. I mean, the decolonization movement isn't just focused on race, for example. It really lies at the intersections of a number of different groups and the intersections of that as well. But thank you for asking the question about diversity. I do think this is also, again, something I wanted to talk about, where we kind of see, or oftentimes it's promoted that diversity is kind of this all-in-one solution in the decolonial question. But actually, it's not. Demographic diversity obviously is great, and universities should reflect the societies that they're embedded in and the diversities within that society. But at the same time, demographic diversity doesn't answer the question of what the decolonial movement really wants universities to answer, which is, how do you begin to undo the global inequality that you've perpetuated and played a role in perpetuating? So whilst diversity is important, it isn't an all-in-one solution to decolonization. And I think we often also forget the fact that universities do get a direct marketable profit from diversity, which is often glossed over. You know, I'm sure if you all look at your student handbooks, your course videos, you'll see people from different ethnic backgrounds, and this is marketable. People want to be going to a diverse workspace or a diverse learning environment, and universities also recognize that. So I don't think diversity should be framed as, oh yeah, well look, we're doing this already, so let's leave it there, when one, it has a direct benefit as well, and two, it's just not enough. It's an important feature, but it's nowhere near enough. Yeah.
I've just got one eye on the time, and we're sort of out of time. Ophelie, did you have anything you wanted to add before we draw it to a close?
Nothing that would be a short answer, I don't think. So
I think we've had quite a few questions coming in about you know, more practical aspects, and there's a follow-up workshop to this session, and that's going to be online next week at the same time. That is only open to Maastricht University staff, and it is nearly full, but there are a few spaces. You can sign up using the same link that you signed up for this session. But in the meantime, we'd like to thank everybody today for attending, and also our speaker and our co-moderator for the session as well. Thank you very much, Ophelie and Aincre, and thank you all back home. Okay.
great, and thank you, Donna, as well. Yes, for organising all of this too.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks guys. We're going to sign off. All right, have a good day.